Our workshop today is entitled Between Globalization and Global Warming, the Long and Short of Human History. And it'll be presented by Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty in the Departments of South Asian Languages and Civilizations and History. And I could spend the entire period of the workshop just introducing Dipesh, and certainly David as well. So I'm going to try and hold the introduction down to a minimum. But as I became aware this year of Dipesh's work on the implications of the science of climate change for historical and political thinking, it seemed to me to be exactly the perfect topic for a workshop which is based on interdisciplinary discussions, and particularly interdisciplinary discussions between the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the humanities, something for which Dipesh is actually uniquely qualified. I happen to know that Dipesh received his Bachelor's of Science degree in physics from the University of Calcutta, then went on to a postgraduate degree in management from the Indian Institute of Management before he found his true calling in history. Dipesh is the author of an enormous number of crucial and important pieces of work. I'm just going to mention a few of these. He's author of Rethinking Working Class History, Bengal, 1890 to 1940, Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, and Habitations of Modernity, Essays in the Wake of Subaltern Studies. He's also working on a couple of forthcoming works, and for our purposes, the really crucial one among these is The Climate of History, 4 theses. After Dipesh's presentation, which will be based, I assume, on that project, we'll have a discussion by Professor David Archer from the Department of Geophysical Sciences. And for those of you who don't know David's work, he is author of 3 important books on global warming: Global Warming, Understanding the Forecast; The Long Thaw, How Humans Are Changing the Next 100,000, yeah. It's printed oddly on my sheet of paper, but it's 100,000 years of the Earth's climate, and co-author of a very recent book, mine just came in the mail this week, The Climate Crisis, An Introductory Guide to Climate Change, which is perhaps the best guide to the IPCC 4th assessment report. And he's also a contributor to the Real Climate blog.
Thanks, Mark, for the invitation to come and speak to the workshop. And thanks to Madeline for organizing it. And thanks to David for agreeing to be here. I think he does the real work. My work is obviously parasitic on what they do, scientists. And thanks to all of you for being here. So very quickly, I got drawn to the topic of climate change because it seems clear to me that this crisis is one of the most important turning points in human history, but historians so far haven't just begun to respond to it. Actually, there's a book that's just out from Germany by a German historian on cultures of climate. There's a group in Essen who are also publishing essays from humanities history point of view. But when I got interested, there was really nothing that historians had written on this crisis. I was also interested because, normally in the kind of social science I do, we talk about globalization, where you emphasize more the politics of difference. So you talk about cosmopolitanism, toleration, how do we live with people who are different. Whereas this crisis really was more about scientists were talking about humanity. They use the category humanity. This is a crisis for everybody, and to think of the human being as humans as a species. So it was interesting that living as we do under the cross pressures, as Charles Taylor says in his book on secularism, the cross pressures of these two discussions, globalization and global warming, I was very interested to navigate my way through these two very different ways of looking at the human being as being endowed with cultural, historical, or what Balibar calls anthropological difference, and the human beings acting like they're already one, constituted as a species, or as something that is one. But what really got me interested was that climate scientists were telling to me was really a human history for the first time, in the sense that there have been climate changes in the past. Normally, somebody like me who does human history wouldn't be reading what David, as a paleoclimatologist, might write. But what was interesting in what the scientists were writing was that they were telling a story of at least the last 250 years, a story which was not human independent. You couldn't take human beings out of that story. So in a way, I think climate scientists were telling us a new kind of human history that I think we should be interested in. The idea that global warming was anthropogenic, human-induced, was really what captured my historical imagination in the first instance. And my final reason for, just to speak as an Indian and as an Indianist, as to why I got interested, theories of aesthetics developed in India, as my Sanskrit friends here will tell you. Usually, by some reckoning, we say that there are 9 different rasas, or juices, or moods of enjoyment through which we appreciate life. Like anger, calmness, the grotesque, humorous, these sorts of divisions we make. And I actually think European rule brought the 10th rasa to India, which we didn't have, which is the rasa of irony. And for me, irony is the main rasa of human history provides, because it's really the shadow that falls perpetually, all the time, between the promise and the performance. That is what constitutes for me, a major aesthetic for doing human history. And what could be more ironical than anthropological climate change in everyday parlance, when in everyday parlance most of us celebrated fossil fuel energy-based societies as the pinnacle of civilization. So in an interesting way, there was a great irony in the whole story. So spurred on by these thoughts, I wrote the first essay that was published in Critical Inquiry last winter, which I called The Climate of History 4 Thesis, in which basically I was trying to argue that because this crisis is human-induced, the usual distinction we make between natural history and human history, in teaching history, reading history, has really collapsed. Because now it's human beings acting as a geological agent on the planet. And so the 4th thesis, they were mainly trying to say that the narrative of capitalism was probably not enough. It was necessary but not sufficient in understanding how this crisis came about. I was arguing for us to the importance of actually thinking about species history and the history of humans as a species. But it's really the 4th thesis that I want to elaborate in my brief talk today. The 4th thesis, I said, was claimed that the cross-hatching of species history and history of capital, that is, history of industrialization, is a process of probing the limits of historical understanding. That was my 4th thesis, and what I want to do is to actually take off from the 4th thesis and elaborate on it. So I said that, so I really will be talking about what I meant by probing the limits of historical understanding. So understanding is going to be a critical word in this talk, because I use it in a very particular sense. But before that, let me just say the debate about climate change also interested me, because I could, in reading people like David, and then reading the kind of stories that are told, for instance, in Anthony Giddens' book on politics of climate change, you realize that there are 2 different historiographies going on. There's one kind of history, the human history, the scientists are telling, and there's another kind of human history that climate activists, particularly led by India and China, tell from within the position that normally goes by the name the climate justice position, which really stems from a book that was written by 2 Indian environmental activists and thinkers, Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, who wrote in 1991 a book called Global Warming in an Unequal World, Environmental Colonialism. And the expression that actually was part of the Kyoto agreement, shared but differentiated responsibilities. That expression was coined by these two Indian activists. And that's very much a part of what is called the climate justice position. And the climate justice position, as you know, basically says the West has created the problem, why should we pay for it? The West should clean up their own mess. And this was very clearly documented in last year, in June 2009, when the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations published their annual document. Subtitle was Promoting Development and Saving the Planet, which was signed off by Mr. Shah Zukung, a Chinese national who was the United Nations Under-Secretary. And it was very much, that document, if you read it, big fat document, is very much the climate justice position. So Shah Zukung, for instance, says the climate crisis is the result of and this is sustained throughout the document. The climate crisis is the result of the very uneven pattern of economic development that evolved over the past 2 centuries, which allows today's rich countries to attain their current levels of income, in part through not having to account for the environmental damage now threatening the lives and livelihood of others. So characterizing climate change as a developmental challenge, that this is a result of uneven economic development. Then he went on to mark the trust deficit that actually marks the relationship between the West and the non-West, whereby typical Indian media reports, which have now been studied in the Journal of Climate Change, are typically mistrustful of the West, to the degree that Indian scientists would sometimes put out statements saying, we are working with the statistics of our emissions because the Western figures are always skewed towards serving the West. And the report actually expands on this point by saying that the government leaders in many developing countries are concerned that climate change is being used by those at the top of the developmental ladder and who gorged excessively on global carbon budget to get there, now trying to constrain the efforts of those other countries to climb higher. How developing countries can achieve catch-up growth and economic convergence in a carbon-constrained world, and what the advanced countries must do to relieve these concerns, have become the leading questions for the policymakers at national and international levels. Now, I want to quickly just draw your attention to the point that there's a lot of problematic propositions built into the climate justice position. So even if you go back to read the Shah Zukung statement again, where Shah Zukung actually says that the current crisis is a result of uneven development. One could also come back and say, when has development been even inside one country? But secondly, if development had been even, if we had all been equally developed, but using the same technology, we would have actually put out even more CO2 and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What has saved us, relatively speaking, if that's saving us, is the fact that the bulk of the people are poor out there. So it's really sort of taking credit for the failure of many of the development programs in these countries. But there's also another question that is hidden in the per capita figure, which is not raised in the climate justice position, which is the question of population. Because obviously the per capita figure depends on the size of the population. Population is one of the major problems in the climate crisis, not because the poor emit very much, but as James Hansen says in his recent book, Storms for My Grandchildren, the two big impending risks of climate change, one is sea level rise, and the other one is extinction of species, which is directly connected to population growth and the destruction of habitat of other species. But this is not raised, but you can actually think of the world divided between past polluters and past populators. Because it has something to do with the fact that in India, family planning was not taken seriously until quite late. Family planning was seen as again a Western contrivance. One of the most celebrated books on family planning was Mahmoud Mamdani's book on population explosion myth, where he was basically trying to argue, and this was very widely celebrated then, that the entire population question was simply symptomatic of unequal development and inequalities in society. And for China, you would remember that even in the 60s, Mao's famous argument that the reason why America was a paper tiger with nuclear teeth, but a paper tiger nevertheless, as he said to Khrushchev, was because that even if they dropped a few nuclear bombs on China, they wouldn't be able to wipe out all the Chinese. We're just so many in numbers, we must win. And I still remember in high school, we used to had a we were given a reader called We Plan for Prosperity, in which the whole argument was that population is an economic resource and the West is trying to rob us of that resource by saying to us we must control families. So there was an ideology against population control. So I would actually say that given that population is a prospective problem and actually central to one of the risks that the crisis portends, one can think of the past populators and the past polluters as two different kinds of responsibilities that countries should bear. But even otherwise, what is interesting is that the story that the climate justice position tells is fundamentally a story of industrialization as imperialism. And it is a known and familiar story, and it's a story that concerns last 200 or 250 years. And here is actually an interesting historiographical divide that is at the heart of this debate on climate change, that while the climate justice position tells a very short-term story of 250 years, stories that we normally deal with, the story that scientists like David or Jim Hansen or James Lovelock or any of these people are saying is actually a story told over a much longer term. I mean, it requires a much longer, larger scale thinking to understand what the crisis is. And also the story unfolds over a much longer period. So David's second book that Mark refers to, The Long Thaw, has the subtitle, How Humans Are Changing the Next 100,000 Years of Earth's Climate. And obviously I'm picking up, as I was saying to David before the talk, that I'm not being a scientist really, not being a policy person, not being an activist, not being an economist. I'm really coming into this question at that point in the book where David actually ceases to be a scientist and raises other kinds of questions that are also questions that speak to us in the humanities and social sciences. So when somebody writes, if you say to a historian how humans are changing the next 100,000 years of Earth's climate, a normal historian today would say 100,000 years, is that the kind of big history that David Christian writes about? There's a movement in history now to even move away from world history into what's being called big history. And that big history starts from the Big Bang and comes to the latest bit in human civilization. I would say yes, but also no. Because what's interesting, in the big history book that David Christian writes, for instance, if you read it, the reason why it doesn't read like a history book is that the first half of the book is all about quarks and electrons and protons. And who would want to sort of, in a history class, I don't think anybody would have any sense of what's happening in what he calls events. What's interesting, I think, in David's kind of work and Jim Hansen's work is that the paleoclimatic scale of thinking is actually connected to human agency, whereas the first half of David Christian's book, Big History, has almost nothing to say about humans because humans were not there when all that was happening. And that's what takes me back to the fourth thesis that in my previous article, where I said the cross-hatching of species thinking and the history of capital, that is of industrialization, is a process of probing the limits of historical understanding. And what I want to do in the rest of my time is actually quickly connect this question of historical understanding with what I see an interesting ethical problem being raised by people like David as well as Jim Hansen and others. So the reason why I said it will bring to a crisis historical understanding is because historians and social scientists generally, but historians in particular, make a distinction between two modes of explanation or two modes of exposition, one of which we call explanation, the other one we call understanding. And explanation is basically when you make causal connections between events. So with regard to the past, you can always make causal connections, but causal connections by themselves don't become what we call human history. So when people try to do purely causal connections, for instance, you will remember that in the 70s there was a very important book on slavery, which got slammed by every historian, and it's Fogel and Engelsman book on slavery, which argued with absolutely rational choice, brilliant mathematics. One of them, of course, was a Nobel Prize winner economist, that slavery was an efficient system of production, which in terms of rational choice made absolute sense, the technical use of the word efficient, but the entire rebellion was in terms of denying the indignity of the slave. And So in history, we think of explanation as making these causal connections, and explanations normally matter because it changes other explanations. So once, for instance, a Russian history friend of mine wrote something debating with a Stanford historian about how many people were killed in Stalin's famine in Ukraine. And Robert Conquest was saying 12 million. My Russian history friend was saying 8 million. And I didn't know anything about Russian history. And I said to him, I mean, does it matter? I mean, even 30,000 would be so shameful for this revolution that wants to speak for everybody. So why are you quibbling over these figures? And that was but I was asking an understanding question. In other words, I was saying, how do I bring this within my imagination? How do I identify with this? Then my friend actually explained that you couldn't explain certain things about Russian industrialization if there were so many people missing. There would have been a crisis in labor supply. Now, that's explanation. One explanation moves other explanations around on the chessboard, but that by itself doesn't make up history. The sense of history is that you have to combine explanation with understanding. And understanding, like Gadamer said in his philosophy of history, understanding happens when you're able to extend your own experience as a human being to the experience of somebody who lived in the past. And it's really when you bring these things together that we have something called history. I'm talking about this because I'm using this as the armature of the debate. I'm saying in reading James Hansen, reading David Archer, I see a point where a similar question emerges when these people ask, okay, human beings will change the climate for so many thousand years, 100,000 years. And what is fascinating in these books written by paleoclimatologists or climate scientists like Jim Hansen or David is that then they ask a question they would have never asked before, I imagine, in writing a paleoclimatic history of this planet. Then they say, but we must care about it. In other words, they raise an ethical question about, or it is an ethical question, that we should care about these changes that might happen over so many hundreds and thousands of years, because normally we wouldn't. So I'll just come to that part of David's book where he's trying to actually raise this argument. And so I'll keep saying, well, I can say Archer, but David distills out of his analysis a problem that I think, in my understanding of history, turns around this explanation, understanding armature, this distinction that I mentioned earlier. And this is what makes it possible to extract a human or even a humanities problem out of his scientific description of the current crisis. And it is also what connects me back to my fourth thesis, that the cross-hatching, when I think of this crisis as, and I want to give agency to human beings as a species, when I cross-hatch that with the history of industrialization, the much longer scale history of life and human being as a species with the much shorter scale history of capitalism, it's a process that forces me to probe the limits of historical understanding. And I'll just explain it by going back to David's text. So humans are now capable of exerting a geological force. The effects of climate change will persist for another 100,000 years. We can manipulate and operate such numbers with ease. That is to say, we can use them as explanatory devices and for making the scale manageable. But do we understand them? And David himself raises this question. Human beings cannot really imagine beyond a couple of generations or after them. I mean, it may be actually a more hardwired problem. Some sociobiologists argue that because evolution is so much about solving the problem right in front of me so that I survive the next day, that human beings are very profoundly present-focused. And so now we're at a stage where we cognitively understand the scale of a problem. So when the scientist explains it. But the scientist himself is raising this question. It's that cognitive understanding is not enough. Do I understand it in order to act on it, in order to care about it? So David writes in the book, the rules of economics which govern much of our behavior tend to limit our focus to even shorter time frames. Values are related across time using interest rates. A $100 obligation in 100 years might be dealt with by investing $5 today at an inflation-adjusted interest rate of 3% per year. A $100 cost in 500 years shrinks to 0.003 cents today. Analyzed within the framework of economics, a climate impact 100,000 years from now becomes laughably relevant to any rational decision-making. I'm imagining the financial guys on the television laughing smugly at how irrelevant it is, ha ha ha. And actually reading Jim Hanson's book, Jim Hanson describes a lunch he was having with Al Gore in 2003, when he was actually, when the administration was trying to silence him. And he was having lunch at Park Hotel, on the Hotel Regency in New York on Park Avenue. And Al Gore introduced him to Larry King to see if Larry King would publicize his problem. And Larry King was sympathetic, but then Hanson writes that when he explained his problem to him about climate change, and Al Gore said, so when will this crisis deepen? He said, oh, in 50, 60 years. Larry King said, nobody's interested in what's going to happen from 50 years from now. And he didn't get the airtime that he was looking for. So I think David faces the same problem, that humans may not care for the science he's telling us because 100,000 years is too far. Why should we care for people so far into the future? The very idea of caring, which is a question of human ethics, brings David's discussion of the problem, discussion into the fold of the problem that I'm calling understanding. How do we bring within the fold of our imagination, and not just explanation, pasts that are truly distant, which is the historian's problem, I might say, futures that seem truly distant. It is interesting to me that David, a scientist, should have recourse to questions of the past in order to explain to his generation of humans why they ought to care for what might happen over 1,000 or 100,000 year scale. When we are beyond the current effects of climate change that David actually describes, even things like Katrina, as subtle. I mean, so David is not an alarmist. He begins with the proposition that what we have seen are subtle effects of climate change. The worst is to come. So having imagined the smug financial guys on television laughing him out of the court, David writes, and yet human cultural memory begins to approach the longevity of our proposed climate adventures. The earliest written records date to 5,500 years ago. Oral traditions may carry some grains of history from earlier still, and this is where he raises a very interesting question. How would it feel if the Greeks, for example, had taken advantage of some lucrative business opportunity for a few centuries, aware of potential costs, such as, say, a much stormier world, or the loss of agricultural productivity because of rising sea levels, that could persist to this day? I actually find it remarkable that Archer, a socially concerned scientist, should be asking us to extend to the future the faculty of understanding that humans routinely extend to the recorded past, not to the deep past, to the recorded past. And yet, I feel that Hanson and David, I mean, Hanson's book is very interestingly, he has two figures of the public. So there are places in his book where he says, if only I could have a rationally informed public, I'm sure they would work on this. And then the other places where he admits that the paleoclimatic scale is too large for people to act on, for people to understand. And that's why I think that David is raising a very interesting problem, which may be asking us to do the impossible. The geological agency that humans have come to acquire for themselves is like a Kantian sublime. We can use numbers and other operators to bring it within the realm of cognition, but our hardware may be such that we cannot ever grasp it in our understanding. The present crisis of climate change, from where I stand, may indeed be a crisis of that particular faculty that people like Gadamer call understanding, the philosophers of history. We face a problem that is of such large proportions that to make it available to human imagination and action, we constantly reduce its time horizon. So it's interesting, like if you look at what kind of time periods people with different specializations talk about in talking about the change. So somebody like a paleoclimatologist will talk about thousands of years. Economists bring it down to 30, 50, 100 years. So the Stern report, the Garneau report in Australia, doesn't look beyond 2050. Then you come to policymakers, and policymakers, whatever hopes one had with Obama sort of at the moment are difficult in terms of caps and emission, even though there are debates about that. But they bring it within an electoral cycle, and that's what becomes most important. So this would have been fine under usual circumstances, but treating climate change as a problem either to be explained by short-term history or to be ameliorated by measures that do not look beyond the next few decades is not to see the nature of the problem and to ignore the history that the scientists tell. In other words, what I'm saying is that the usual distinction between climate deniers and people who accept that the climate crisis is actually almost a false distinction, because there is a kind of denial of the long term on all sides. I mean, neither the people in the climate justice position nor people in the West are actually developing policies. In fact, as I speak, Jim Hansen is in Australia and slamming both political parties for their options, because the ruling party is trying to bring a cap-and-trade emissions policy, and the Liberal Party is in denial, and he gave a lecture on this question. So actually what I find fascinating is actually a situation where the cognitive knowledge is available. I mean, it's been available for a long time. Naomi Oreskes gave a very fine lecture showing how the scientific consensus has actually been there for the last 50 years. So it's not like the scientific consensus goes back to the IPCC 7th report. The 2007 report. So there's a political problem, I think, that David's book raises. What we do today to affect climate may have a hugely negative impact on generations that may come way after our grandchildren are gone. But as organisms, we may not have the hardware to bring such distant futures within the grasp of our imagination, what I'm calling understanding. The world temperature, they say, has been relatively stable for the last 1 decade, making the task of communication by scientists to general public or even policymakers extremely difficult. And the failure of Copenhagen has kind of resulted in a huge wave of what I think is sponsored kind of denialism. But an article by Andrew Revkin in New York Times last September, cites the case of several such scientists. And let me quote one example, a very well-known scientist based in Germany, Mojiv Latif, who is a prize-winning climate and ocean scientist from Leibniz, wrote a paper last year in 2008 positing that cyclical shifts in the oceans were aligning in a way that could keep the temperature over the next decade or so relatively stable, even as the heat-trapping gases linked to global warming continued to increase. But Dr. Latif, who gives about 200 talks to the public, business leaders and officials each year, said that he had been met with confusion and even anger when he tried to describe this normal variation in climate, while at the same time conveying the long-term threat of global warming. People understand what I'm saying, but what he means here by understand is that they get my explanation. But then basically one day wind up saying, we don't believe anything. And that's a kind of problem that comes up in both David's writing and what we see in Jim Hansen's writing. So let me just quickly conclude saying that where I see the problem standing. The climate crisis is a very interesting crisis, because on the one hand, there is a certain tendency that the climate justice position puts forward, which is to see it as a problem mainly among human beings, which is why the question of justice arises. In other words, to see the climate crisis as a human project. So if you think about human societies from the time that we know of human societies, there are certain things that have been like constants in documented human society. God is a human constant in one form or another. Similarly, the question of justice is a human constant. I can't imagine a human society where people don't get exercised by questions of justice, whether or not we agree with their definition of justice. So justice is a fundamentally human project. Nature is justice blind. Nature doesn't care about what the per capita is. Nature cares about how much we're putting out there. And it's for the first time, I think, particularly the social scientist and historian and humanities person, where all our thinking are deeply, profoundly human-focused, and turn around these existential questions of being human, like justice, like God, like divinity, and where we extend social science by going into phenomenology, ontology. We are up against a problem of the climate cycle, for instance, of this planet, which has to do with life. I mean, even the bacteria in the soil have a role in determining the carbon cycle of the planet. So there is a kind of, if you can imagine it, there's a sort of natural history of life, which is part of nature, which is blind to justice. Whereas the debate is completely focused on the question of justice. And that's where it's getting stalled. But I often wonder whether it actually doesn't represent a much greater crisis, which is that the order of this crisis is so big that it's actually putting stress on our faculty, a particular faculty, which is what we see at play in anthropology, we see at play in history, writing history, human history, which is the faculty that Gadamer would have called the faculty of understanding. And that's why my fourth thesis was that if we really want to understand the scale of this crisis, for a historian, it ends up being an exercise of probing the limits of what philosophers of history call understanding, historical understanding. So I'll end there. Thanks. Thank you very much.
So I came here with nothing prepared to tell you. I'm deeply curious to hear what's going to come out of my mouth now that I'm sort of sitting here on the spot. I guess the first thought that came to me as I was listening to Dipesh and thinking about all of this is one of ethics, which is, a social sciences sort of philosophical construct. I guess on the long term, I do feel like ethics does drive human behavior because that's the only explanation I can think of as a non-historian for the abolition of slavery. Presumably slavery was pretty economically lucrative, and it no longer exists much on Earth, presumably because we decided that it's wrong. There are ethical issues with climate change too, one having to do with this divide that Dipesh is talking about between the rich countries and the poor countries. The benefits to fossil fuel consumption and our sort of energy-intensive lifestyle accrue here to where we're burning the gas or using the electricity. And I just have to point out that here we're sitting in this room with abundant sunlight coming in, and yet all the lights are on and the fans are running. We don't think anything of it, but there's a couple hundred watts probably in here of energy, so you could imagine some guy on a bicycle pumping away trying to keep those lights going. Can I stop now? No, keep going. You have to keep going because we want the lights on. We sort of don't think about it. Each person in the developed world uses something like 60 times more fossil energy than our own metabolic output. So it's as though we each are living like, the Pharaoh of old with 60 slaves to do all of our bidding. Yes, keep the lights going because I bid that I deem that it shall be so. And then there's also an ethical divide between us and the people in the deep future. So this whole economic idea of a discount rate to figure out, whether to pay money to avoid climate change or just try to figure out how much climate change would cost, which is dicey in and of itself because you have to, put an economic value on rainforests and coral reefs and human lives and things like that. But the whole question of balancing the cost of, mitigation versus the cost of enduring climate change becomes ethically very almost offensive when you start thinking about how the people that reap the benefits of having the fans going, whatever those benefits are not the same people as are paying the cost. The idea of the longevity of climate change is sort of new to the climate science community as well because of, as far as I can tell, because of a typo in the IPCC reports, not in the main bodies of the reports where all the technical stuff is, but in the summary for policymakers up until the most recent one, it said that the lifetime of fossil fuel CO2 in the atmosphere is a couple hundred years. And the way it really works is that a lot of the carbon goes away in a couple hundred years as it dissolves in the ocean, but there's this sort of long tail, so the climate impact stretches into a long time. And if you actually calculate what the temperature of the Earth does, it takes a while for the warming to catch up to the CO2. So the CO2 spikes and then comes down, but the warming kind of goes up throughout the spike, and it basically just looks like it changes to a warmer state and then stays there for, essentially, as far as we're concerned, it stays there forever. So, do we care about that? Geologists sort of trained to think about deep time. There's this wonderful book published in the 60s, I think, by Loren Isley called The Immense Journey. He's very poetic, describing, the beauty of sort of thinking about deep time, looking at a rock that's been sculpted by the wind over thousands of years, kind of brings us to something that's larger than ourselves. But, in terms of awareness of that, as implication of our running the stupid fans all the time. It's sort of new to the climate science community as well as everybody else, I think. I wrote this book because I wanted to make that known. Nuclear waste lasts for tens of thousands of years, and what really, I remember this article in the New York Times Magazine 15 years ago or something about trying to design a sign to put up outside of Yucca Mountain to say, don't come here, this is evil, this is bad, but what kind of language, who's going to read that sign? You start thinking about writing something down and making it last for 10,000 years, and even 10,000 years is shortchanging it for nuclear waste as well as for the climate impacts. So it really does stretch the imagination to think that far. IPCC reports and economic analyses like the Stern Report go to the year 2100 or something, which is a year that I probably won't see, maybe some of you will, but even that is just a drop in the bucket compared to the longevity of what we are all about. So I think we chit-chat now, right? Great. So questions or?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, as I said, I learned from these guys about the enormity of the problem, and I mean, Jim Hansen, as you know, is backing nuclear power in spite of the nuclear waste problem. Partly, because his recommendation is that you immediately stop the production of coal. That's his first recommendation. And of course, that it's impossible to think of Chinese plans for generating electricity, Indian plans for generating electricity without coal, and Australians' plans for prosperity without exporting coal to China, and all the DOE statistics. So fundamentally, it seems like what Hansen recommends can't happen. It seems to me that in terms of world politics, and I mean, it's not theoretically impossible to think that can happen, but to give up on the addiction to coal is something that I can't see politicians doing. That's why I was very interested in this question of whether or not the kind of ethical problems that you raise or he raises actually opens up the domain for a third kind of politics. Because at the moment, the politics of climate change, it seems to me, is so caught up between the climate justice position, where both in India and China, economic development, they say, comes before the climate question. I mean, that's their official position. And the official position, and it imagines the kind of growth that we've seen in the West. It's not like they're not imagining any other kind of growth, the same pattern of growth. And actually, there's a very, very interesting Greenpeace document about India, which actually shows that if you took the poor out of the picture, then and only took into account the emissions of the affluent classes in India, then they produce together, the numbers are such that they produce actually more CO2 than Australia does as a whole. So there is an argument in that politics about the rich wanting to hide behind the poor. So in other words, what politics can you have? Can you ask of your own nation the kind of politics that you're asking of the globe? In other words, where you're asking the rich nations to give up on their climate fix, carbon fix, where your own elite are as much dependent on carbon fix as the world elite. So there are very interesting problems there, and that's why, because when I read you and when I read people like Hansen, Hansen actually explains, and Wallace Broker in Fixing Climate does the same. They actually explain why human-induced climate forcing actually can produce bad results in terms of decades, like 30, 40, or 50 years. So you cognitively see the problem that they're talking about. But what I think very interesting in climate change, the science of climate change brings up against, are really deficiencies in our political imagination and political thought. So, for instance, as you know, sort of Mike Maslin, makes this point that the electoral cycles of Western democracies create a kind of timetable for politics, which makes it very, very difficult for politicians to actually take really tough decisions which are going to be electorally unpopular. So, faced with this situation, and looking for optimism, what I wonder about is whether you see it or whether you think it could happen. There could be other kinds of popular mobilization of imagination in different ways, in working through different cultures in different ways, but kind of would have to be synchronized in some way or another to put pressure on politicians to actually make the changes that we need. I mean, do you see anything like that happening that gives you hope, or do you take hope from other things? I mean, even you're not an alarmist, but you don't seem despairing either.
My most optimistic picture would be that eventually the grown-ups will be in charge and realize that there's this ethical thing that putting CO2 in the air is causing harm to others and should be stopped. Technologically, it's not a challenge to stop doing that. Right. It's just a question of inertia. So I expect if the droughts and storms continue to worsen, the pressure will just ratchet up, and eventually it'll be like an oil spill or something. It'll just have to be cleaned up, and probably it'll cost a lot more to clean it up than if we had just stopped it in the first place. But we're not that intelligent a species to really totally avoid that problem. But if we do end up having to clean it up, the U.S. has emitted a quarter of the CO2, the extra CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So we are seriously on the hook here, and rightfully so.
Are you moderating, Mark?
I'll moderate.
Okay.
Which gives me the opportunity to ask the first question. Dipesh, this is an extraordinarily rich document, the article, the Climate History 4 Theses. And I know we say that all the time, that things are rich, but it really is. There's a lot to talk about here, including the intellectual and political emancipatory capacity of crisis, the construction and understanding of nature, the historicity of anthropogenesis, the intersection of capital and species, the moral economy of social and natural worlds. But the question I want to ask today really goes to the issue of justice and equity.
Right.
And really that interplay between population and affluence. Right?
Yeah.
And the distaste, both politically and intellectually, that many have, especially for neo-Malthusian arguments in the political realm. Okay. But given that there is an enormous lag in causes and consequences, and that the solutions occur in a human political realm, then that human realm of justice becomes a real issue.
Yeah.
Right? So if it can be questioned, if, say, the role of population and of demographic variables can be questioned, why can't the role of affluence be questioned equally?
Oh, no, I mean, I actually think the role of affluence should be absolutely questioned. In fact, when I was giving a talk in India about this, and I said something which deep down would be seen as completely utopian. But I actually said that, look, if you think of the capitalist system as producing, the consumerist capitalist system producing the lifestyle, the irrationalities of our lifestyles, surely proportionately it's a much smaller number of smaller percentage of Indian population that's hooked on it as stakeholders than in the West. So why can't India, instead of pursuing a Western model of development, opt out and actually work on some other model of development, so that we actually become leaders, intellectual leaders for the world, rather than constantly painting us as victims and say, we want what you've had, which is not to give up the addiction to coal, because coal is the cheapest source of energy and it's the dirtiest source. I often wonder, why is it that why should be the onus on other countries to actually persuade India and China to give up this addiction to coal? I mean, they should themselves think about the larger questions. And here, an interesting problem is that, at least I don't know about China, but Indian scientists don't write the kind of books that Jim Hansen or David or James Lovelock or Western scientists do. And there's a very interesting problem from the philosophical historical side, which is that they use the category humanity, that this is humanity's crisis. whereas in the Indian discussion is always a crisis made for India by the West, right? And there's some justice in it. I mean, I'm not denying what David is saying. So I actually think the question of differentiated, shared but differentiated responsibility is a real question. But at the same time, theoretically, one could ask of Indians, why can't you be the leaders? Why couldn't you now think of a different model of development, given that there's a fewer percentage of your population that's so invested in it? But here I'm not at all sure that, in an impersonal sense, the climate activists are not actually speaking for the interests of the elite population, which is why they're much less insistent on carbon justice or climate justice internally. And there's a tension between Sunita Narayan, Agarwal is dead now, who represents kind of almost the official position, and the Indian Greenpeace, who actually then say to them, why don't you do internally, within the nation, what you're asking for globally? And now I saw that in the latest document they have just actually inserted a line about this. But somehow in India it's assumed that you need coal-powered electricity to raise everybody from poverty. And I think the poverty is a serious question. We need to sort of raise people from poverty. But if you read Hansen, and if you think of Hansen as writing as a scientist, which is I'm sure which is what he's trying to do, the two basic problems he talks about from climate change, which are going to affect human societies, one is sea level rise, the other one is extinction of species. And he actually makes the point that if the sea level rises, then there's much less life, edible life for us within the sea. You wouldn't have such a variety of fish. So I kind of think why there are interesting questions to be raised. What is the status of the category humanity? What is the status of the category species? So I think the question of affluence should be raised, and it's almost an unasked question within India.
I have a feeling that people in our society, or at least in the West, have a false consciousness about this whole thing. I think they're in denial or some kind of addictive haze or something. They don't seem to think about it. I'm just wondering, how much time do we have to turn that around, to get people really seriously thinking?
I think David is the best person to answer that question.
In general, the maximum temperature rise, the warmest of the warm, depends on how much carbon is emitted over the whole fossil fuel era. So we've already started, and we've emitted a certain amount, which turns out to be about half the amount that we can emit and limit the warming to less than a value of 2 degrees centigrade, which is a number that they sort of talk about as, that's where things start to get really, really, really scary. Above 2 degrees C, rainforests collapse and ice sheets collapse, and you're talking a different order. So if we were to start cutting emissions today at a rate of a few percent per year, which is perfectly realistic, it could taper down, and the total slug that we would have released would be just about enough to keep warming below that 2 degrees C. Not to say that 1.9 is safe. Jim Hansen argues, I agree with him, that there are droughts already ongoing today, so that we're sort of at the danger limit. But the longer we wait, however, the steeper those cuts have to be, and the more expensive it would have to be in order to get done.
So you're saying the time is now?
The sooner we start, the cheaper it will be. It's like you're sitting there watching an ongoing oil spill. Do you just let it go for another day or two before you plug the leak and then start cleaning it up, or do you start cleaning it up now?
And as they say in the West, it will cost us money, and in poorer countries, it will cost them lives.
Yeah.
There's perhaps some hope to be had in looking back at the story.
Yeah.
Insofar as it seems to me that, you're absolutely right that the geological agency of man is now crystal clear should be to everybody. But it seems to me that we have had premonitions of geological agency for at least 250 years. The debates on soil degradation, on species extinction, on what energy regimes have in store for us, those are old debates.
Mm-hmm.
For example, 1865, Stanley Jevons, the coal question, which predicts the impending end to coal in Britain within half a century or so. I mean, he was perhaps slightly alarmist on that point, but you get my drift, right? So it seems, so in some sense, that shallow future, that's a fixation of the present or the haze, the consumer's haze, those are relatively new things. And we can, there's a repertoire of other voices out there already. For instance, there's a kind of economics that takes the land seriously. It's called classical political economy. And it's stipulated that a stationary state was inevitable, right? That physical geological limits would put an end to growth, such that you couldn't make the discounting argument with a sober face.
Yeah. No, I mean, there are two things. You know, one is that the economic argument, which only goes so far. So, for instance, you can use price as a regulator of behavior. So you make something pricey so that people either find substitutes or use less of that commodity. But the problem is that, you know, there are certain, in this climate science, there are certain things on which for which you can't find substitutes. So the ocean as a sink for CO2. I mean, you can't find a substitute for it. So you can't use a pricing mechanism, it seems to me, as a way of controlling that. But on the other hand, where I think historians are very helpful, and this German historian's book, the name escapes me, I think it's called Cultures of Climate, or something like that, which has just been translated into English. It's sort of digging into human memories, as you talk about, but memories of how human beings have dealt with the sense of catastrophe, the sense that we might be finite and facing a kind of species extinction for ourselves. And I often wonder whether, if what I'm saying is right, that if on the one hand there is sort of, we have two kinds of politics. One is the West is do nothing, and the East is saying we won't do anything until you do something. And both are in denial of climate science, right? So we're putting the deniers to one camp. Whether there is room for another kind of movement, which will be in response to the popularization of actually the scientific knowledge. And I often wonder what sort of role scientists would play in it, what kind of roles filmmakers would play in it, what kind of new myths would have to be made. And in making of those myths, maybe the older myths, the older repertoires would play a role. And in some ways, historians do have a role, it seems to me, in excavating those repertoires and making them available. And also in, as you said, in reminding us that the debate is older. But see, the critical question goes back to what you asked, and maybe it's possible that David and Hansen don't agree on this. The impression I get from reading Hansen's popular book, Storms for My Grandchildren, is that if we keep on the path of business as usual, which is what all the projections from DOE and seems to be, that at least until 2030 we will be more or less on a path where more than 80% of the energy will come not from renewables but mainly from fossil fuel in different combinations. Then from reading Hansen, I get the impression then the risk of getting beyond what you guys call a tipping point, where human beings lose control of the climate change process. In my reading of his, it sounds like he's talking about decades. He's not talking about even the end of this century on a business as usual assumption.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree. I wouldn't disagree with that. Business as usual to 2030 would be a disaster.
Right. So that's the urgency, and how do you communicate that urgency beyond electoral cycles? And particularly, I think the failure of Copenhagen, talking about real politics, has had a really negative influence on all this sponsored denialism. So they find one mistake in IPCC, the evidence volumes, which is to do with Himalayan glacier, and the mountain that has been made, out of that molehill is just amazing. And that wouldn't have happened without sponsorship. I'm absolutely convinced.
I have two questions. He was making the historic legacy argument, which India then took to Copenhagen, saying that the West needed to pay for what they've emitted for anybody to change. And it's difficult because I'll live into the future, we're all going to live into the future, but I think that new development models would allow India to reap the benefits of having a population. I think it's 50 or 60% of the population isn't on the energy grid, or will eventually be on the energy grid, and they have tremendous room for innovation and can reap economic benefits from it. So I thought that was ironic, and would love to hear what you have to say about it. And the second thing is, why haven't we turned off the lights of the fan?
It would deprive me of a great rhetorical tool.
But the first point is that, what I don't hear enough of, really, in the Indian discussions is our alternative models of development. You hear about the odd village that Pachauri's institute has produced electricity in by using gobar gas or whatever. But it's like sort of, microfinance, a little bit happening here, a little bit happening there. Whereas when you read the government documents, it's really about a kind of growth that we know. The picture is no different from what we have in the West, and that's and that's the irony there.
This is a question for Professor Chakrabarty. Sir, this is a comment from a philosophical standpoint. I was curious about your seeking for something that could ground or make available the requisite scales in which we should be concerned, right? So one comment on that is that ethicists like Derek Parfit, for example, have worked on the question of whether it is rational to be concerned with future generations, and very much been concerned to see whether any action guiding norms can be driven out of our current norms of action. It turns out he thinks it's rational not to care. But there is a large body of work. But one of the things that's interesting about his work is that it hinges on coming to think of ourselves not in terms of almost like a pre-scientific world picture, but to see that what matters to us usually when we think about ourselves is causal connectedness. And that one of the things we do to revise the kind of self-image we have that would make it difficult for us to see future generations just the way past generations are causally central to our concern is because we're not thinking under causal paradigms of self-control.
Yeah.
Now that having been said, I'm curious because the rest of your remarks to the question suggest that you're interested in what stories we could tell, and in what ways to get the short-term concern of let's fix the kinds of behavioral patterns we're in. But would any story do? I mean, we've got large traditions, say in India, that have been telling very scaled-up stories about concern in our lives, where the scale would not be a problem with our self-image, even though they're not scientific images, right?
Yeah.
But would that do, or would it have to be accurate to the facts?
No, that's the point, because sometimes when you read scientists like not just Jim Hansen, even Edward Wilson and other scientists, they have a view of politics sometimes which I find, coming from the other side, I find is too dependent on the assumption that politics equals collective rationality. Right? That there will be a kind of rational collective choice that we can make. Whereas clearly, politics is, if you think of politics as the realm of our freedom, we have the freedom to harm ourselves. And we may very well make the choice that will harm ourselves. So in some ways it seems to me that if politics is not the realm of collective rationality, then we clearly need to mobilize affect and other kinds of things in order to help people, in the Gadamarian sense, understand what the problem is that scientists are talking about. Right? So in other words, that's what I find fascinating, is that I think theoretically David's book, and they open up this space actually, where, because they don't always think like that, but in our terms, in Hansen for instance, or David's book, they're actually asking the question, how do I persuade you? Right? When David is saying we should care, and then he gives you the example, okay, think about it, if early Greeks had done this, the problem is I can always come back and say, but look, if the early Greeks had done it knowingly, it would have been one thing. But if they did it unknowingly, like when we got fixated on the transition from wood to coal, for instance, it's not like people knew. right? I mean, this science of global warming goes back to late 19th century, early 20th century, right? So one can always come and say in this debate, why would all of the West be responsible, purely in terms of logical terms, for having committed something that they had no knowledge of? Whereas today, his question is, how can I not feel responsible for something that I have the knowledge about doing, right? But you see, but there, in their thinking, what I find is what we often do. We sort of make the collective that will make a decision, a nation or whatever, into the model of a rational self, right? And politics is actually about the domain in which the collective doesn't work as a rational self, which is why fear mongering, I mean, like Oreskes shows it quite clearly that some of the people involved in climate denialism are people who are involved in the tobacco debate. And the tobacco debate, and the same kind of argument, science is not settled, let's give more money to research, or that suddenly you hear that all the climate scientists are saying this because that's where the funding is. As if science would ever be free of the politics of funding. But you see, they are precisely addressing the public, knowing that the public does not represent a collective rational self, right? And whereas in Jim Hansen, because he thinks of American democracy as something which is constantly distorted by special interest lobbying, right? And again, he has a point. I mean, I saw the figure somewhere that at the moment there are more than 2,000 lobbyists in Washington working on climate change, right? Trying to fix the problem from their point of view. So obviously he's recognizing a large chunk of reality, but then he thinks that there are special interest groups and there is the public, and there's a deep belief in the founding principles of American Constitution, American democracy. And all of that I value, and I think that belief is a very important resource. But it seems to me that if there is to be a politics by which governments come under pressure within the electoral cycles and things, so actually to do something, it will need to be about another kind of imagination. And that's where I'm saying that it will not be a rational calculus. It cannot be. Because politics, again, I'm speaking like a humanities person, politics means the freedom to actually make a mistake and even harm yourself. So we may very well, and that is something that when scientists write, and I'm thinking of Edward Wilson here, even when he writes with the hope, or people who coined this idea Anthropocene, and who often sort of recommend large-scale geoengineering projects. There is a kind of belief that is transferred from the rationality of scientific thinking into a domain where you think that the rationality will inform decision-making. It will to some degree, but it's modified by other things. And that's where I kind of imagine another space opening up as a possibility, where the scientists might actually work alongside modern mythmakers, films and other kinds of agencies, and which will have to negotiate cultural difference, because the argument that might persuade somebody in India may not be the argument that persuades somebody here. So, but at the same time, because of the commonness of the crisis, you need a kind of timetable of synchronization. So it's a damn difficult, if not totally utopian, project to think about. But their writing does open up that space.
Winston Churchill once said that the Americans can be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives.
So I have a question. You mentioned something about people listening to explanations about climate change and what's happening, and scientists writing books, but not believing. They're not getting it or not wanting to believe. And I feel like science has a long track record of explaining things that are unobservable and really large or really small and totally counterintuitive. I mean, if you just put someone on the street, they believe that the sun revolves around the earth, and we all know it doesn't. But why don't we believe that climate change is happening? Well, some people believe it, some people don't. And is it a failure of science? Is it a failure of, combating conventional wisdom or something else?
I mean, I was saying that it's not. In other words, I'm saying that this is a conversation which involves not just the cognitive parts of our brain. So it's not, there are multiple multiple ways of processing information going on, and and some of it's coming from other traditions of processing everyday experience. And somehow, if this message has to sink in, and if the politics of changing climate change policy, if that has to be a popular politics, in other words, where governments have to come under pressure, not just from the special interest groups, but also from the population in general, then there's a question of how do you persuade people, which is classically a question of rhetoric, right? I mean, if you think of all the writings on persuasion, it belongs to the domain of rhetoric. So the scientific rhetoric persuades within a certain domain, but I'm saying, but it alone doesn't. I mean, that's what these scientists are reporting, that when we speak, they say, okay, we can understand the problem, but they're not going to go home and start doing things differently. Yeah.
This is really relating back to what you were saying about India and how you have the elites who are modelling themselves on Western consumption, and then a large portion of poor, say, or people who don't want to have access to that, and trying to persuade people and so on. I'm wondering whether Gandhi is completely out of favour and not persuasive enough to be drawn on again as someone who was really, in a way, sort of almost, foreseeing this.
Look, the two things I'm saying. If you look at the Indian white paper on climate change, it begins by quoting Gandhi. It says, as Mahatma Gandhi said, there's enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. And the second sentence says, but we guarantee that our per capita emission will never exceed that of the United States. Right? But so Gandhi has an iconic presence. I mean, I don't think Indians are imagining a different kind of developmental trajectory. They're not, and that's very clear.
Okay. Before we take the last couple of questions, after this, I'd like to ask everybody to sign in on the sign-up sheet in the back. It's very important to us. It's how we get our funding. Okay? And after this question, we'll continue the conversation over refreshments in the back of the room. So I'll allow you the last one.
I was going to say, I agree with you. I think, people don't listen. I think there's a split between scientists and everybody else. And people don't normally listen to scientists in terms of how they live their lives, And so I do think it's really important now for people who are not scientists or to come forward as leaders and to start mobilizing public opinion using other means, as you say. I mean, I really think that will have to happen.
But I think scientists and non-scientists can work together because you really need the knowledge, which they have.
Of course, but I mean, make people see it.
Right.
And on the note of making people see it, I'd like to thank Dipesh and David very much. And thank you all. And please help yourselves with refreshments in the back of the room.